So, do you feel like the story of Sudan has been forgotten?
The story of Sudan, looking back from the end of 2023, is one that I find really dispiriting, actually. The Khartoum that I left, that I last saw in 2020, will never exist again. Not only are we dealing as Sudanese people with the weight of the country collapsing, but it's also having to deal with it in relative silence, in an international media context where there are other wars that people are paying more attention to. And it feels like the Sudanese people are mourning and grieving alone.
7 million people have been displaced. Over 1 million people are now refugees in neighboring countries. The amount of death that has been recorded, according to UN numbers, at least 10,000, probably higher. So I think we do have one of the largest catastrophes of last year still unfolding and still ongoing.
This time 5 years ago, we were witnessing the beginning of protests that would hail the end of the Bashir regime.
Reports say that Sudan's military has forced President Omar Al Bashir to step down, ending 30 years of rule.
And there was this real period of excitement. It felt like, finally, we were going to be known for something apart from a genocide in Darfur, apart from the longest civil war on the African continent.
Sudan's December revolution really caught the world's attention as one of the most outstanding, largely nonviolent movement in recent decades. It provided images that I thought were very unforgettable. Many in the world will remember the image of Ala Salah, the young Sudanese woman who mounted a car, raised her hand, dressed in a traditional Sudanese tobe. The one image that for me, that remained in my mind of that era really was April 6th. A few days before the removal of al-Bashir, was to see the amount of protesters in front of the army headquarters. I thought that was a game changer. To me, that signaled that the end of the government was near.
وعليه أعلن أنا وزير الدفاع رئيس اللجنة الأمنية العليا اقتلاع ذلك النظام والتحفظ على رأسه بعد اعتقاله في مكان آمن.
During this transitional period after the revolution of 2019, I think you could look at it and see this kind of Game of Thrones-like situation between two components of the military establishment.
They then, turned against each other. And that's what we saw in April 2023.
Fighter jets circling overhead, firing missiles. Gunfire interrupting a live television broadcast.
The two main belligerents, as we like to call them, are Hemeti, who's the head of the Rapid Support Forces, and Burhan, who's the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces. Both Hemeti and Burhan worked together in 2021 to overthrow the Transitional Council and declare that they were protecting the revolution. Of course they were not. It was about returning Sudan to a military, autocratic regime. Once the two generals overthrew the civilian-led government, then it became, well, who's going to be the top dog? The Rapid Support Forces, that are this irregular paramilitary militia, essentially, that came out of the Janjaweed, which roughly translates to devils on horseback, were responsible for the genocide in Darfur that happened 20 years ago. In some ways, the easy story is to say that it is a tale of two generals or a tale of two belligerents. I myself use that framing sometimes because it felt like a way to quickly talk about what was going on. But of course, that's only the superficial story. The real story is about a challenge that Sudan has faced over the decades since independence, and that is, how do you govern a country like Sudan without being a general? People have lots of different ideas for why Sudan doesn't get the attention internationally that other conflicts do. part of it is because it's in Africa, and honestly is the fact that in the international media, stories of conflict in Africa aren't seen as that interesting. They're seen as par for the course. Another reason I think really does contribute to the lack of international media is the challenge for journalists on the ground. In 2022, there was about 1,100 journalists working in Sudan. And this was a great moment, actually, because under the Bashir regime, journalists were really, really suppressed. A recent report that came out of a UNESCO-supported survey said that about 90% of those journalists are unemployed now.
The displacement of Sudanese that has come with the war includes, of course, journalists and their families. According to a recent report by Reporters Without Borders, 26 newspapers have stopped production, 10 radio stations have stopped. The news coming out of Sudan by Sudanese journalists has taken a hit. And that includes journalists who normally work with international media outlets, ground producers, fixers, translators, freelancers. But there are, of course, some Sudanese news outlets that I think that are still doing some good work. Radio Dabanga has become really an important source of information. Sudan Tribune. Of course, these are news outlets that have bases outside of Sudan. So I think the role of the diaspora does play an important role in covering Sudan.
There's quite a lot of pressure on those particular journalists to communicate what is happening to the world, especially those who are reporting in English. I mean, there's the case of Yusra al-Bagher, who was doing a report on displaced people in Port Sudan, who ended up seeing one of her relatives in the crowd.
And as the crowd parts, but that's my uncle. That's my uncle. I'd mercy him. No.
It really sums up the challenge for journalists in Sudan, trying also to report to the rest of the world. It's not just a distanced thing. It's not just a theoretical story.
As we enter 2024, we're starting to see a trickling of interest in Sudan again. Trying to keep attention to what is happening in Sudan is something that's important, especially that many of us think that as bad as the situation is in Sudan, it still can get worse. It is moving into a situation where Sudan could easily become what Somalia and Afghanistan were in the 90s, a complete collapse of the state. And I think that would just simply be a disastrous situation.
I spend a lot of my time feeling like I'm in two selves. There's a self that lives in London, that is physically safe, that has coffee with my husband in the morning. And there's the self that is in the conflict, that is watching the news, that is seeing the images of, babies dying in orphanages left alone because nobody's there to save them, of women that describe awful abuses that have been visited on their bodies, and also feeling this pressure to really do something about it, because that responsibility is real. And I think there is some sense, whether it's diaspora saviorism mentality, whether it's, the idea that we want to be able to just fix it, but you have to be able to just focus on what is within your control. Who are the individual people you can help? What are the individual stories you can share that will move the needle? If all it is today is sending a message to every single one of your family and checking that they're alive, that's important too. That has a place too.